Right, everyone, thank you so much for joining. Welcome to the Inclusion Conversation. This is episode 13, and I'm so happy to see you. So for those who are joining for the first time, the Inclusion Conversation is a monthly talk show, and it's all about breaking down borders and bringing the world closer together, one conversation at a time. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that, to be honest, I want to learn about because I feel like there's so much that I don't know about it. And that's minority stress and how it relates to creativity and resilience. So very, very shortly, we're going to be hearing from Paul, our guest for today. And this is going to be the rundown for the conversation for tonight. So we have the first half hour is going to be talking with Paul and asking him questions about the topic. And that's recorded, and that's what people are watching now if they're watching on YouTube. And the second half is the conversation. So it's going to be inviting everyone in this room to ask any questions they have, but also to share their own personal stories and personal experiences linked to this topic. So thank you for joining live if you are. This is actually the second part is my favorite part. I say that every time if you've joined more than once, but it's true. I mean it. So a little bit of a reminder for those who have joined before, and a little bit of first time hearing this, I suppose, for those who are joining for the first time. So in terms of the etiquette for this call, we are recording. If you're comfortable to have your cameras on, that's awesome. We feel then we're talking to people. If you prefer to have it off, that's also fine, of course. We have the subtitles and the closed captions enabled, so hopefully it should be working. So you should be seeing them at the bottom of your screen. You can interact in the chat. So yeah, if you want to say where you're from and who you are, please do that. And any reactions or questions, just pop them into the chat in the first instance. And then in the second half, you can just raise your hand or literally just unmute and talk to us. In terms of mindset, conversations around these topics can be quite triggering and sensitive and personal. So just to invite everyone to approach the conversation with curiosity and with kindness and respect for each other. There aren't any breaks in the hour, so if you need one, just take it and come back. So that's it for the little intro, and I'm delighted to have a very special guest with us today. And I really mean that because amongst many other things that he's going to cover, Paul is a very special person in my life because when I was at literally my lowest point of lowest points, I spoke to him and he gave me support and guidance. And thanks to him, I was able to get my diagnosis and the help that I needed, and I'm really much better for it now. So it's very, very special to have you here today, Paul. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. So can you first tell us a little bit more about you?
Of course, I'd love to. I'm really happy to be here and so good to be doing this with you. So thank you for that introduction. So yeah, my name's Paul. As you say, I'm 40 now. I noticed my picture is a bit old that you just put up there, which is a bit embarrassing, but it's fine. I'm a former actor who then went on to train as a therapist after about a decade in theatre. Trained as a therapist about 12 years ago, and I've been doing that for since then. And in that time, I love my work. I love working with individuals and the challenges and satisfaction that brings. But I wanted to reach a wider audience, and I was introduced to the idea of research, which I thought I would never be able to do, never smart enough to do. And during the pandemic, actually, I started a doctorate, and challenging, demanding, but also very exciting. And my first bit of research was actually working with or trying to understand how equipped therapists were to work with the trans and non-binary population, because we know they face a lot of discrimination, and that put me onto the idea of minority stress, which came up in the research, which I hadn't really thought about much before or heard about much before. I'm a gay man. I carry with me a lot of privilege in terms of being white and now educated. But I also, have had my own mental health struggles and various health things, which I'll come on to later. So that's kind of where I position myself at the moment.
Amazing. Every time I hear, your introduction or just learn about you, I'm just like, wow, you're someone who definitely has led multiple lives. That's for sure. Not many people can say, yeah, I was on stage doing theater and now I'm a therapist and now I'm doing a doctorate and so many different things, which is super inspiring.
I would fire that back at you, Solène, because you're pretty inspiring with all the things that you do. And I think that's one of the things of
Stop
minorities. We do tend to push and do many things. So thank you.
And that is a nice transition to, I suppose, setting the scene around, you said minorities, we tend to do lots of different things, perhaps as part of, this topic. So can you kind of, take a step back, start from the beginning? How would you define minority stress? What is it?
Sure. So it's a concept, a theory, if you like, that was introduced by an epidemiologist that's currently still working at UCLA in the States, who recognized a particular pattern of stress that minorities tend to experience. It's particularly around stigmatization and being on the margins of society. So it covers, or part of minority stress, there are internal and external factors. And the external factors, as you might imagine, are the stigma, the discrimination, the prejudice we might face, overt violence and bullying, which is obviously awful, but it's external to us. And then within the other elements of the stress that we experience are more internal factors. Just to add actually on the external, it's not just those events of prejudice that we experience, but it's the culmination of over a lifetime of having to live in a society, I guess a dominant majority society that tends to devalue, even if not explicitly so, minorities. And so back to the internal stressors. So minority people tend to then internalize those external stigmas, and they think about, they expect rejection. We expect discrimination, potentially, they expect even bullying and harassment or even violence. We can become hypervigilant. We can conceal, if it's possible. With being gay, for example, you can try and conceal that you're gay. And you can often internalize homophobia in my case, or internalize maybe racism or ableism and all of these other situations from a dominant society. And so the interaction between these two internal and external stresses then often lead to worse both mental and physical health outcomes, which is really sad actually to understand. That's an overview briefly.
Yeah, it's important to set the scene and to understand the external and internal, and acknowledge. It's hard sometimes to acknowledge that you might yourself have integrated, for example, ableist attitudes, in my case, with mental health, and you just have to unpack and unlearn so much when you realize that. What has it been like for you personally? Like, how have you experienced minority stress?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's something that only in the last few years dawned on me, and I had to kind of unpick it and go backwards. And it was a period of grief, actually, of really understanding potentially what has happened, but also of an empowerment as well. I think in relation to you mentioning your diagnosis, and for you, that was quite an empowering moment. And I think similarly with minority stress, it gave me a structure or a concept to hang some of my experiences on. So in terms of personally, so if we're looking at the external things that maybe happened, which are very common, I guess, in a minority's life, and in my case, in a young gay boy's life, I had bullying at school, which again is a very common thing for minorities. I was lucky that it wasn't awfully violent, but it was consistent and it was psychological, and obviously it was stigmatizing. And in addition to that, I've not seen my dad since I was a teenager. He didn't like that I was gay. And so those two things kind of set the scene for me from the external stresses. And then subsequent discrimination and prejudice throughout my life. Again, I've been very lucky compared to some people. but just the expectation of those things are always just around the corner is part of the internal stuff that gets internalized. And so because of these experiences, I became quite isolated, became very self-sufficient, kept people at arm's length for safety. I became preoccupied with passing as straight because that was safer. I pumped myself up in the gym thinking that would provide a power and a safety as well. Yeah, just generally very self-conscious about how I came across, how I talked, how I carried myself. And then a few other things. I became terrible with money, very short-termist in terms of trying to soothe myself in the moment by spending money and not thinking about the future. Having relationships that were quite bad, anxiously attached to people, accepting things that I wouldn't accept now, for example. And just general doubting myself in most things that I would do, despite succeeding, always having that doubt, which I think is a legacy of minority stress. And then finally, to bring the health aspect into it, I'd always suffered from various, always had colds and IBS symptoms, allergies, and mental health stuff. So usually anxiety for me, but sometimes depression off and on throughout my life. And then 5 years ago, almost to the day, actually, I got diagnosed with cancer. And this was a lymphoma, so a cancer of the blood and the immune system. And this was really a bit of a trigger for me to really investigate. And I don't draw a direct line between minority stress and cancer, but I do think it provided the conditions for my cancer to take hold, ultimately, because of the chronic stress that I'd experienced as a minority throughout my life, ultimately.
Yeah,
That's
it's
a lot.
very interesting.
Sorry.
No, I'm just reflecting on that last part, and I was actually in my head wondering if perhaps there are studies that are starting to show certain correlations between the two. Have you come across anything along these lines, like between minority stress and the psychological impact and that physiological consequence or correlation, because it can just go hand in hand in parallel? Have you come across any of that?
I have. It's a hard thing to study because there's so many variables, and particularly the guy Ilan Mayer, the professor who talked about minority stress in the beginning, developed it. He spent his life kind of looking for that evidence and refuting criticisms of this theory, because it's intersectional as well. It can obviously social economic situations exacerbate it, very much. But there are increasing studies that do show a direct link from health disparities, mental and physical health, to a life of chronic stress. And minorities face stress as everybody else does, but an additional layer of stress, particularly linked to stigmatization and then minority status. So yes, it's there and it's emerging.
Yeah, and masking as well, like the effort that it takes to show up with your mask all the time and feel like you can't truly just be
yourself. It's exhausting, right? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Definitely. And we're gonna start now to explore, because the title, right, for today is Minority Stress, Resilience and Creativity, and I'm keen to start to draw these lines and parallels. So starting with resilience, and that kind of seems logical in many ways, but can you explain a little bit more about how do you think and how are you studying this link between minority stress and resilience?
Right. I mean, and this is where it becomes a bit more hopeful, because so far it's a little bit glum and depressing, but it doesn't need to be. And actually, resilience is already baked into the idea of minority stress. Luckily, it's not just you have bad health outcomes at the end. It's because we experience different levels of adversity throughout our lives. We have to cope most of the time, and we do. We develop this resilience off the back of this, and it is very sad that some people don't survive, but most of us do survive, and many of us do thrive as we were talking about previously. But yeah, resilience is a major part of the minority stress kind of theory. And I guess, yeah, we could talk about myself, pushing myself to get on the stage against all the competition and the odds, and studying at the level I'm studying now and becoming a therapist. And yeah, that does show a lot of resilience. And again, the same for you, where you've got to in your life now. So it comes mostly from the inner resources that we have to find, but also the communities that we end up finding ourselves in. The community you've created here, for example, the gay or trans communities, queer communities, the communities based on racial identities, for example, they nurture us in a way maybe that we weren't able to be nurtured initially, and that really foments that resilience, I would say.
Yeah, I love that point around the importance of community. I'm definitely discovering that, and it's really, really amazing. And yeah, what you said definitely resonates in terms of, like, I suppose that there's deep down that inner child as well that wants to stand up to the bullies and want to prove that, you know, you can do this. And then there's that element of, you know, like you said, defying the odds. And then there's that addiction to also achieving. So there's so many different layers to it. And one thing that I do wish that someone told me before was the difference between resilience and resistance, because I used to think that resilience was like, you show up, you're always strong, you know, you're like a tree, you're like embedded and grounded, and this is me, and I do know,
right, impervious.
But actually, resilience is more about that fluidity and the ability to, you know, pivot and reflect and push through, but not to the extent where you're going to break yourself, but to the extent that you're going to be able to react, bounce back, try something else, leverage community, like you said, and really learn and continue to grow and continue to evolve. I think that's really interesting. Now I look at it as like the tree versus the flower, and the wind is like whatever comes your way, which could be stigmatizing, bullying, racism, ableism, homophobia. We've talked about different things. That's the wind. And if you're the flower, you're able to kind of go with it and kind of adapt to it. Resilience. If you're the tree, you might break if the wind is too strong, if you're resisting with all your strength and all your mighty. And then
that's hugely important.
Kind of links to the physical elements that you talked about, the mental elements that you talked about.
Well, exactly, and how you know, where does the body go? If you're using the tree metaphor, where does the body go apart from into disease, I guess, or mental or physical disease? What you're describing there is the difference between coping and resilience. Coping doesn't necessarily mean that you're successfully doing it. You're just trying. You know, you're resisting or you're trying to avoid. Whereas the resilience is actually the point where you've kind of got back to the point you should have been at if this stuff hadn't have happened to you. And that's super important.
Yeah, or even go beyond that point, hey?
Well, that's my point here, yes.
So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, creativity is a bit of a further one, right? Because I mean, in a way, like, for example, in my mind, I just think everybody is creative, right? We've just been taught at school that some of us are more than others because we've made this kind of weird shortcut between creativity and art. But actually, we're all creative because we're all, in essence, able to come up with new ideas, which is what creativity is all about. But in the title, there is a link. So tell us about that kind of link between minority stress and creativity.
Sure. And this is the bit that I'm particularly excited about and keen to study. And to be honest, at the minute, it's still a hypothesis. Like I'm in the weeds of my doctorate. This is the bit that I'm studying and figuring out. But my real deeply held feeling and hunch is that it is vitally important in extending almost this minority stress theory to an application and how to thrive, not just survive, as you say. Because I think many of us do survive, most of us survive, many of us do thrive, but not all of us, and with a cost involved, unfortunately. And so I think as minorities, we have a very unique vantage point, I guess, at the margins to kind of look at society. We have a sensitivity to us. We can recognize at a deeper level, I believe, the beauty of the world, but also the cruelty of it. We can laugh at it, we can lampoon and parody it more, we can question taken for granted kind of norms. And I think that puts us in an ideal place to be creative. And as you say, we're all creative, we're human beings. But I think, again, and I'm exalting minorities here, which I think is important, but I think we actually have an additional talent in this area to actually tap into that creativity because of our unique position in society. Many people do. You think about all the incredible artists in all different forms, formal artists, writers, painters, dancers, everything in history. Many of them are minorities expressing their adversity, expressing their hopes. But I think that there's a whole tranche of people who are not given permission, don't give themselves permission. It's unexplored potential that I think the world is missing out on. And it doesn't have to be in the formal arts, go and suddenly become a painter. It can be, but just about bringing that creativity in beyond just surviving. I think it's around that permission, I think, giving ourselves that permission to be creative. And we're all trying to do it in different ways, but some of us more than others, some of us more successfully than others. And I'm not talking about a commercial successful, but just how much of your soul, yourself you're using beyond just surviving and living your life like other people. I think we've got more to offer.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, like that element of creativity, because you have a different point of view, and so you're bound to be creative too, because I feel like when you're part of a minority, you face so many challenges that you have to be creative in terms of finding workarounds and finding ways to, at the beginning, perhaps fit in because you think that's the only way. And then eventually, hopefully, if you're able to accept yourself and leverage those challenges as your strengths, then use your creativity to challenge the status quo, to explore different ways, offer different ways. So I think there's that. But then also I think what I'm reflecting on from what you said is there's also the element of using creativity in recovery or in thriving. So, I see, for example, I'm part of another talk show. Anybody who wants to watch, there's more, Solène, oh my goodness. It's called the BPD Bunch. And we're 18 people in functional recovery from BPD, and we share our stories. And everyone in the group has a creative pursuit, whether, as you say, they commercialize it or not, that's totally entirely up to them. But I'm just in awe and amazed by what everybody's doing, whether it's drawing, writing, doing some theater or making clothes, it's just absolutely incredible. And everyone in that group will say that creative pursuit was instrumental in them acquiring mindfulness skills, which often will help unlock a lot of these aspects of resilience, which then help to find that sense of belonging. So yeah, there's maybe that link as well, which is super interesting.
Yeah, I love that. It makes me think of, interestingly, it fits into the internalized shame and the minority stress thing. But I used to be really disinterested, almost a bit phobic of drag queens as a gay man, which is a bit of a rarity, because I think it was the very overt expression of the feminine, of that side of myself that I always tried to hide. And actually, in the last decade or so, it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I love watching Drag Race, for example. The creativity, the kind of bravery it takes, and the lampooning of society, but also the exaltation of art. So it's just a really beautiful thing to see, just as a small example.
Yeah, I think it's really important to own these elements as well. I've noticed that we tend to be, it's back to that internalized ableism or internalized racism or internalized homophobia. We tend to often dislike or distance ourselves from the part of ourselves that we are actually struggling with or ashamed of in some way. I found that with weight, for example, and having certain biases in terms of, you know, interacting with people that are overweight because of my own story and the bullying that I faced around that area. And same thing with disabled people. And now I work with disabled people and I love it. And, you know, I'm like in the community and it's amazing. But, you know, back a few years having that fear, you know, and that resistance, and you think, what is happening here? Yeah, again, it's so much unlearning. We tend to think, oh, well, I need to learn, but actually there's so much stuff that's been drilled in from just trying to survive as a minority and trying to fit in some way, and then it's like, well, unpacking all of that to live differently. I have a bit of a provoking question, maybe.
Go for it. Yes.
Before we wrap up this part, isn't everyone a minority?
Interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that you know, there are so many different groups in society. For example, if you think as a woman, we're a minority. Well, actually, we're a majority in numbers in many ways, but we're a minority in the sense that most of us live in patriarchal societies around the world. So that's already 52% that could be, you know, seeing themselves as a minority. And then even then, if you take then, okay, let's just assume men is a majority, then within men, you know, you'll have people from race and ethnic minority backgrounds, you have the LGBT community, you have disability community, low socioeconomic background, education, you know, etc., etc., etc. So I guess my question is, could we all see ourselves in this minority stress in some way?
Sure. I mean, I think so. I mean, in a way, I guess the utopia is that we're all just people living together, and there's no majority, no minority. We're just people. That isn't the case right now. So we kind of need to demarcate who's in which groups, if you like, and figure out our own experiences and find resonance in other people. In many ways, I would of course put women into a minority group because of the patriarchy. For minority stress theory, less so, I think, just because it was mostly developed initially around gay men, lesbian women, and bisexual people, and then it became around racial identity, particularly around Black people against white people in America, and then more recently around the transgender and non-binary community. So I guess we were looking originally at race and gender and sexual minorities, but it also embraces disability and mental health. It's ever increasing. I think ultimately this is just about human beings, of course it is, but we're looking to create a community of people who feel they've experienced minority stress, a place to belong. And I actually think that yes, everyone is a minority in the general sense, but in particularly in minority stress, I think it is important to have an intersectional lens, but definite kind of categories, if you like. Everyone is welcome, but there are definite experiences that certain minorities have different to the majority, I would say. Maybe I fudged that question, but that was my version.
Yeah, and I suppose that even within minorities, you might have people that experience minority stress less so than others, depending on the circumstances that they grew up in, and because you'll have also sub-communities, areas in a given country where you might be in a minority situation in the country, but in that specific region, actually, you're in the majority. I'm just making something up, but that could also, I suppose, if you grow up in a specific community, for example, a kind of close community in some way, maybe the experience could be different. So it would be interesting to kind of, I suppose, survey minorities and kind of get a sense of what's the percentage that would identify with the symptoms or the manifestations of minority stress.
Because many might not, or might not think it's maybe, I don't know, even pathologizing to think of it in terms of minority stress. It's not, you don't have to agree with this. It's just a useful tool, I think, for many people who resonate with it. But for example, my version of minority stress, if we compare to maybe a trans person of color, for example, who identifies as gay as well, like it's going to be super different. Again, that's where privilege comes into an intersectionality. Like all of our experiences are super different. And actually, one of my, I'm studying myself as part of this doctorate in the beginning, and then I'm going out to the community. But part of the question was, does anyone even want to hear my story? This is my self-doubt again. Do I have the right, or, you know, have I suffered enough for that to be important for people to hear? But actually, it's not really about me. It's me using myself as a bit of a guinea pig to say, this is how it can manifest. I want to hear about you as well now. It's a starting point, really.
What a perfect way to end this portion of the conversation, because yes, we'd love to hear from everyone who is in the room. So before we do that, I'm just gonna wrap us up for the recording. So I will just share, just for anyone watching the recording, you can join us live next time so that you can get to be part of the conversation afterwards. Next time is going to be an episode that is actually the last episode of season 1, which has been going this year, and so it's going to be a bit of a different wrap-up episode. We're going to be having lots of our previous guests, so we had 22 guests this year, and some of them are joining us for a bit of a reflection episode on inclusion and how they've progressed this agenda over the past year. You can follow us on Instagram if you don't already. That's at @BeyondBorders, and you can subscribe to the newsletter on beyondborders.com. And also, if you want to watch any previous episodes, they're all on the YouTube channel, and we've covered lots of topics so far, so there's plenty to watch if you're bored at home and you'd like to do something. This is the opportunity. And so hopefully for anyone watching the recording, we will see you for episode 14.